The Poisoned Chocolates Case, Part 2. Chapter 6. "I dare say," resumed Sir Charles, "that many of you will have already reached the same conclusion as myself with regard to the identity of the murderer. The case seems to me to afford so striking a parallel with one of the classical murders that the similarity can hardly have passed unnoticed. I refer, of course, to the Marie Lafarge case." "Oh," said Roger, surprised. So far as he was concerned, the similarity had passed unnoticed. He wriggled uncomfortably. Now one came to consider it, of course the parallel was obvious. There too we have a wife, accused of sending a poisoned article to her husband. Whether the article was a cake or a box of chocolates is beside the point. It will not do, perhaps, to— But nobody in their sane senses still believes that Marie Lafarge was guilty, Alicia Dammers interrupted with unusual warmth. It's been practically proved that the cake was sent by the foreman, or whatever he was. Wasn't his name Dennis? His motive was much bigger than hers, too. Sir Charles regarded her severely. "I think I said accused of sending. I was referring to a matter of fact, not of opinion." "Sorry," nodded Miss Dammers, unabashed. "In any case, I just mentioned the coincidence for what it is worth. Let us now go back to resume our argument at the point we left it. In that connection, the question was raised just now," said Sir Charles, determinedly impersonal, "as to whether Lady Pennefather may have had not an innocent accomplice, but a guilty one. That doubt had already occurred to me. I have satisfied myself that it is not the case. She planned and carried through this affair alone." He paused, inviting the obvious question. Roger tactfully supplied it. "How could she, Sir Charles? We know that she was in the south of France the whole time. The police investigated that very point. She has a complete alibi." Sir Charles positively beamed at him. "She had a complete alibi. I have destroyed it. This is what actually happened. 3 days before the parcel was posted, Lady Pennefather left Mentone and went, ostensibly, for a week to Avignon. At the end of the week, she returned to Mentone. Her signature is in the hotel register at Avignon. She has the receipted bill. Everything is quite in order. The only curious thing is that apparently she did not take her maid, a very superior young woman of smart appearance and good manners, to Avignon with her, for the hotel receipt is for one person only. And yet the maid did not stay at Mentone. Did the maid then vanish into thin air?" demanded Sir Charles indignantly. "Oh," nodded Mr. Chitterwick, who had been listening intently. "I see. How ingenious." "Highly ingenious," agreed Sir Charles, complacently taking the credit for the erring lady's ingenuity. "The maid took the mistress's place. The mistress paid a secret visit to England, and I have verified that beyond any doubt. An agent, acting on telegraphic instructions from me, showed the hotel proprietor at Avignon a photograph of Lady Pennefather and asked whether such a person had ever stayed in the hotel. The man averred that he had never seen her in his life. My agent showed him a snapshot which he had obtained of the maid. The proprietor recognized her instantly as Lady Pennefather. Another guess of mine had proved only too accurate." Sir Charles leaned back in his chair and swung his glasses in silent tribute to his own astuteness. "Then Lady Pennefather did have an accomplice," murmured Mr. Bradley, with the air of one discussing the three bears with a child of 4. "An innocent accomplice," retorted Sir Charles. "My agent questioned the maid tactfully and learned that her mistress has told her that she had to go over to England on urgent business, but, having already spent 6 months of the current year in that country, would have to pay British income tax if she so much as set foot in England again that year. A considerable sum was in question, and Lady Pennefather suggested this plan as a means of getting round the difficulty with a handsome bribe to the girl. Not unnaturally, the offer was accepted. Most ingenious, most ingenious." He paused again and beamed round, inviting tributes. "How very clever of you, Sir Charles," murmured Alicia Dammers, stepping into the breach. "I have no actual proof of her stay in this country," regretted Sir Charles, "so that from the legal point of view, the case against her is incomplete in that respect. But that will be a matter for the police to discover. In all other respects, I submit, my case is complete." I regret exceedingly having to say so, but I have no alternative. Lady Pennefather is Mrs. Bendix's murderess." There was a thoughtful silence when Sir Charles had finished speaking. Questions were in the air, but nobody seemed to care to be the first to put one. Roger gazed into vacancy, as if looking longingly after the spoor of his own hair. There was no doubt that, as matters stood at present, Sir Charles seemed to have proved his case. Mr. Ambrose Chitterwick plucked up courage to break the silence. "We must congratulate you, Sir Charles. Your solution is as brilliant as it is surprising. Only one question occurs to me, and that is the one of motive. Why should Lady Pennefather desire her husband's death when she is actually in process of divorcing him? Had she any reason to suspect that a decree would not be granted?" "None at all," replied Sir Charles blandly. "It was just because she was so certain that a decree would be granted that she desired his death." I I don't quite understand," stammered Mr. Chitterwick. Sir Charles allowed the general bewilderment to continue for a few more moments before he condescended to dispel it. He had the orator's feeling for atmosphere. "I referred at the beginning of my remarks to a piece of knowledge which had come into my possession and which had helped me materially towards my solution. I am now prepared to disclose, in strict confidence, what that piece of knowledge was. You already know that there was talk of an engagement between Sir Eustace and my daughter. I do not think I shall be violating the secrets of the confessional if I tell you that not many weeks ago Sir Eustace came to me and formally asked me to sanction an engagement between them as soon as his wife's decree nisi had been pronounced. I need not tell you all that transpired at that interview. What is relevant is that Sir Eustace informed me categorically that his wife had been extremely unwilling to divorce him, and he had only succeeded in the end by making a will entirely in her favour, including his estate in Worcestershire. She had a small private income of her own, and he was going to make her such allowance in addition as he was able. But with the interest on the mortgage on his estate swallowing up nearly all the rent he was getting for it, and his other expenses, this could not be a large one. His life, however, was heavily insured in accordance with Lady Pennefather's marriage settlements, and the mortgage on the estate was in the nature of an endowment policy, and lapsed with his death. He had therefore, as he candidly admitted, very little to offer my daughter. "Like myself," said Sir Charles impressively, "you cannot fail to grasp the significance of this. According to the will then in existence, Lady Pennefather, from being not even comfortably off, would become a comparatively rich woman on her husband's death. But rumours are reaching her ears of a possible marriage between that husband and another woman as soon as the divorce is complete. What is more probable than that, when such an engagement is actually concluded, a new will be made? Her character is already shown in a strong enough light by her willingness to accept the bribe of the will as an inducement to divorce. She is obviously a grasping woman, greedy for money. Murder is only another step for such a woman to take, and murder is her only hope. I do not think," concluded Sir Charles, "that I need to labour the point any further." His glasses swung deliberately. "It's uncommonly convincing," Roger said, with a little sigh. "Are you going to hand this information over to the police, Sir Charles?" "I conceive that failure to do so would be a gross dereliction of my duty as a citizen," Sir Charles replied, with a pomposity that in no way concealed how pleased he was with himself. "Humph," observed Mr. Bradley, who evidently was not going to be so pleased with Sir Charles as Sir Charles was. "What about the chocolates? Is it part of your case that she prepared them over here or brought them with her?" Sir Charles waved an airy hand. "Is that material?" "I should say that it would be very material to connect her at any rate with the poison. Nitrobenzene. One might as well try to connect her with the purchase of the chocolates. She would have no difficulty in getting hold of that. I regard her choice of poison, in fact, as on a par with the ingenuity she has displayed in all the other particulars." "I see." Mr. Bradley stroked his little moustache and eyed Sir Charles combatively. "Come to think of it, you know, Sir Charles, you haven't really proved a case against Lady Pennefather at all. All you've proved is motive and opportunity." An unexpected ally ranged herself beside Mr. Bradley. "Exactly," cried Mrs. Fielder Fleming. "That's just what I was about to point out myself. If you hand over the information you've collected to the police, Sir Charles, I don't think they'll thank you for it. As Mr. Bradley says, you haven't proved that Lady Pennefather's guilty, or anything like it. I'm quite sure you're altogether mistaken." Sir Charles was so taken aback that for a moment he could only stare. "Mistaken?" he managed to ejaculate. It was clear that such a possibility had never entered Sir Charles's orbit. "Well, perhaps I'd better say, wrong," amended Mrs. Fielder Fleming, quite dryly. "But my dear madam—" For once, words did not come to Sir Charles. "But why?" he fell back upon, feebly. "Because I'm sure of it," retorted Mrs. Fielder Fleming, most unsatisfactorily. Roger had been watching this exchange with a gradual change of feeling. From being hypnotized by Sir Charles's persuasiveness and self-confidence into something like reluctant agreement, he was swinging round now in reaction to the other extreme. Dash it all, this fellow Bradley had kept a clearer head after all, and he was perfectly right. There were gaps in Sir Charles's case that Sir Charles himself, as counsel for Lady Pennefather's defence, could have driven a coach and six through. "Of course," he said thoughtfully, "the fact that before she went abroad, Lady Pennefather may have had an account at Mason's isn't surprising in the least. Nor is the fact that Masons send out a complimentary chit with their receipts. As Sir Charles himself said, very many old-fashioned firms of good repute do. And the fact that the sheet of paper on which the letter was written had been used previously for some such purpose is not only not surprising when one comes to consider, it's even obvious. Whoever the murderer, the same problem of getting hold of the piece of notepaper would arise. Yes, really, that Sir Charles's three initial questions should have happened to find affirmative answers does seem little more than a coincidence. Sir Charles turned on this new antagonist like a wounded bull. "But the odds were enormous against it," he roared. "If it was a coincidence, it was the most incredible one in the whole course of my experience." "Ah, Sir Charles, but you're prejudiced," Mr. Bradley told him gently. "And you exaggerate dreadfully, you know. You seem to be putting the odds at somewhere round about 1,000,000 to 1. I should put them at 6 to 1. Permutations and combinations, you know." "Damn your permutations, sir," riposted Sir Charles with vigour. "And your combinations, too." Mr. Bradley turned to Roger. "Mr. Chairman, is it within the rules of this club for one member to insult another member's underwear? Besides, Sir Charles," he added to that fuming knight, "I don't wear the things. Never have done since I was an infant." For the dignity of the chair, Roger could not join in the delighted titters that were escaping round the table. In the interests of the circle's preservation, he had to pour oil on these very seething waters. "Bradley, you're losing sight of the point, aren't you? I don't want to destroy your theory necessarily, Sir Charles, or detract in any way from the really brilliant manner in which you've defended it. But if it's to stand its ground, it must be able to resist any arguments we can bring against it. That's all. And I honestly do think that you're inclined to attach a little too much importance to the answers to those three questions. What do you say, Miss Dammers?" "I agree," Miss Dammers said crisply. The way Sir Charles emphasized their importance reminded me at the time of a favorite trick of detective story writers. He said, if I remember rightly, that if those questions were answered in the affirmative, he knew that his suspect was guilty just as much as if he'd seen her with his own eyes putting the poison into the chocolates, because the odds against a coincidental affirmative to all three of them were incalculable. In other words, he simply made a strong assertion, unsupported by evidence or argument. "And that is what detective story writers do, Miss Dammers?" queried Mr. Bradley with a tolerant smile. "Invariably, Mr. Bradley. I've often noticed it in your own books. You state a thing so emphatically that the reader does not think of questioning the assertion. 'Here,' says the detective, 'is a bottle of red liquid, and here is a bottle of blue. If these two liquids turn out to be ink, then we know that they were purchased to fill up the empty ink pots in the library as surely as if we had read the dead man's very thoughts. Whereas the red ink might have been bought by one of the maids to dye a jumper, and the blue by the secretary for his fountain pen, or 100 other such explanations. But any possibilities of that kind are silently ignored. Isn't that so? Perfectly, agreed Bradley, unperturbed. Don't waste time on unessentials. Just tell the reader very loudly what he's to think, and he'll think it all right. You've got the technique perfectly. Why don't you try your hand at it? It's quite a paying game, you know. I may one day. And anyhow, I will say for you, Mr. Bradley, that your detectives do detect. They don't just stand about and wait for somebody else to tell them who committed the murder, as the so-called detectives do in most of the so-called detective stories I read. Thank you, said Mr. Bradley. Then you actually read detective stories, Miss Dammers? Certainly, said Miss Dammers crisply. Why not? She dismissed Mr. Bradley as abruptly as she had answered his challenge. And the letter itself, Sir Charles? The typewriting. You don't attach any importance to that? As a detail, of course it would have to be considered. I was only sketching out the broad lines of the case. Sir Charles was no longer bull-like. I take it that the police would ferret out pieces of conclusive evidence of that nature. I think they might have some difficulty in connecting Pauline Pennefather with the machine that typed that letter, observed Mrs. Fielder Fleming, not without tartness. The tide of feeling had obviously set in against Sir Charles. But the motive, he pleaded, now pathetically on the defensive. You must admit that the motive is overwhelming. You don't know Pauline, Sir Charles? Lady Pennefather? Miss Dammers suggested. I do not. Evidently, commented Miss Dammers. You don't agree with Sir Charles's theory, Miss Dammers? Ventured Mr. Chitterwick. I do not, said Miss Dammers with emphasis. Might one inquire your reason? Ventured Mr. Chitterwick further. Certainly you may. It's a conclusive one, I'm afraid, Sir Charles. I was in Paris at the time of the murder, and just about the very hour when the parcel was being posted, I was talking to Pauline Pennefather in the foyer of the opera. What? Exclaimed the discomfited Sir Charles, the remnants of his beautiful theory crashing about his ears. I should apologize for not having given you this information before, I suppose, said Miss Dammers with the utmost calmness. But I wanted to see what sort of a case you could put up against her, and I really do congratulate you. It was a remarkable piece of inductive reasoning. If I hadn't happened to know that it was built up on a complete fallacy, you would have quite convinced me. But why the secrecy? And the impersonation by the maid, if her visit was an innocent one, stammered Sir Charles, his mind revolving wildly round private aeroplanes and the time they would take from the Place de l'Opéra to Trafalgar Square. Oh, I didn't say it was an innocent one, retorted Miss Dammers carelessly. Sir Eustace isn't the only one who is waiting for the divorce to marry again. And in the interim, Pauline, quite rightly, doesn't see why she should waste valuable time. After all, she isn't so young as she was. And there's always a strange creature called the King's Proctor, isn't there? Shortly after that, the chairman adjourned the meeting of the circle. He did so because he did not wish one of the members to die of apoplexy on his hands. Chapter 7. Mrs. Fielder Fleming was nervous, actually nervous. She shuffled the pages of her notebook aimlessly and seemed hardly able to sit through the few preliminaries which had to be settled before Roger asked her to give the solution which she had already affirmed, privately, to Alicia Dammers, to be indubitably the correct one of Mrs. Bendix's murder. With such a weighty piece of knowledge in her mind, one would have thought that for once in her life, Mrs. Fielder Fleming had a really heaven-sent opportunity to be impressive, but for once in her life she made no use of it. If she had not been Mrs. Fielder Fleming, one might have gone so far as to say that she dithered. "Are you ready, Mrs. Fielder Fleming?" Roger asked, gazing at this surprising manifestation. Mrs. Fielder Fleming adjusted her very unbecoming hat, rubbed her nose, being innocent of powder. It did not suffer under this habitual treatment, just shone a little more brightly in pink embarrassment, and shot a covert glance round the table. Roger continued to gaze in astonishment. Mrs. Fielder Fleming was positively shrinking from the limelight. For some occult reason, she was approaching her task with real distaste, and a distaste at that quite out of comparison with the task's significance. She cleared her throat nervously. "I have a very difficult duty to perform," she began in a low voice. "Last night I hardly slept. Anything more distasteful to a woman like myself it is impossible to imagine." She paused, moistening her lips. "Oh, come, Mrs. Fielder Fleming." Roger felt himself impelled to encourage her. "It's the same for all of us, you know, and I've heard you make a most excellent speech at one of your own first nights." Mrs. Fielder Fleming looked at him, not at all encouraged. "I was not referring to that aspect of it, Mr. Sheringham," she retorted, rather more tartly. "I was speaking of the burden which has been laid on me by the knowledge that has come into my possession, the terrible duty I have to perform in consequence of it." "You mean you've solved the little problem?" inquired Mr. Bradley, without reverence. Mrs. Fielder Fleming regarded him somberly. "With infinite regret," she said, in low, womanly tones, "I have." Mrs. Fielder Fleming was recovering her poise. She consulted her notes for a moment, and then began to speak in a firmer voice. "Criminology I have always regarded with something of a professional eye. Its main interest has always been for me its immense potentialities for drama. The inevitability of murder, the predestined victim, struggling unconsciously and vainly against fate, the predestined killer, moving first unconsciously to, and then with full and relentless realization, towards the accomplishment of his doom, the hidden causes, unknown perhaps to both victim and killer, which are all the time urging on the fulfillment of destiny. Apart from the action and the horror of the deed itself, I have always felt that there are more possibilities of real drama in the most ordinary or sordid of murders than in any other situation that can occur to man. Ibsenish in the inevitable working out of certain circumstances in juxtaposition that we call fate, no less than Edgar Wallace-ish in the catharsis undergone by the emotions of the onlooker at their climax. It was perhaps natural, then, that I should regard not only this particular case from something of the standpoint of my calling, and certainly no more dramatic twist could well be invented, but the task of solving it too. Anyhow, natural or not, this is what I did, and the result has terribly justified me. I considered the case in the light of one of the oldest dramatic situations, and very soon everything became only too clear. I am referring to the situation which the gentlemen who pass among us in these days for dramatic critics invariably call the eternal triangle. I had to begin, of course, with only one of the triangle's three members, Sir Eustace Pennefather. Of the two unknown, one must be a woman, the other might be woman or man. So I fell back on another very old and very sound maxim and proceeded to chercher la femme. "And," said Mrs. Fielder Fleming very solemnly, "I found her." So far, it must be admitted, her audience was not particularly impressed. Even the promising opening had not stirred them, for it was only to be expected that Mrs. Fielder Fleming would feel it her duty to emphasize her feminine shrinkings from handing a criminal over to justice. Her somewhat laborious sentences, too, obviously learned off by heart for the occasion, detracted, if anything, from the interest of what she had to convey. But when she resumed, having waited in vain for a tributary gasp at her last momentous piece of information, the somewhat calculated tenseness of her style had given way to an unrehearsed earnestness which was very much more impressive. "I wasn't expecting the triangle to be the hackneyed one," she said, with a slight dig at the deflated remains of Sir Charles. "Lady Pennefather, I hardly considered for a moment. The subtlety of the crime, I felt sure, must be a reflection of an unusual situation. And after all, a triangle need not necessarily include a husband and wife among its members. Any three people, if the circumstances arrange them so, can form one. It is the circumstances, not the three protagonists, that make the triangle. Sir Charles has told us that this crime reminded him of the Marie Lafarge case, and in some respects, he might have added, the Mary Ansell case too. It reminded me of a case as well, but it was neither of these. The Molyneux case in New York, it seems to me, provides a much closer parallel than either. You all remember the details, of course. Mr. Cornish, a director of the important Knickerbocker Athletic Club, received in his Christmas mail a small silver cup and a phial of bromo seltzer, addressed to him at the club. He thought they had been sent by way of a joke and kept the wrapper in order to identify the humorist. A few days later, a woman who lived in the same boarding house as Cornish complained of a headache, and Cornish gave her some of the bromo seltzer. In a very short time she was dead, and Cornish, who had taken just a sip because she complained of it being bitter, was violently ill but recovered later. In the end, a man named Molyneux, another member of the same club, was arrested and put on trial. There was quite a lot of evidence against him, and it was known that he hated Cornish bitterly, so much so that he had already assaulted him once. Moreover, another member of the club, a man named Barnett, had been killed earlier in the year through taking what purported to be a sample of a well-known headache powder which had also been sent to him at the club, and shortly before the Cornish episode, Molyneux married a girl who had actually been engaged to Barnett at the time of his death. He had always wanted her, but she had preferred Barnett. Molyneux, as you remember, was convicted at his first trial and acquitted at his second. He afterwards became insane. Now this parallel seems to me complete. Our case is to all purposes a composite Cornish-Barnett case. The resemblances are extraordinary. There is the poisoned article addressed to the man's club. There is, in the case of Cornish, the death of the wrong victim. There is the preservation of the wrapper. There is, in Barnett's case, the triangle element, and a triangle, you will notice, without husband and wife. It's quite startling. It is, in fact, more than startling. It's significant. Things don't happen like that quite by chance. Mrs. Fielder Fleming paused and blew her nose, delicately but with emotion. She was getting nicely worked up now, and so, in consequence, was her audience. If there were no gasps, there was at any rate the tribute of complete silence till she was ready to go on. I said that this similarity was more than startling, that it was significant. I will explain its particular significance later. At present, it is enough to say that I found it very helpful also. The realization of the extreme closeness of the parallel came as quite a shock to me, but once I had grasped it, I felt strangely convinced that it was in this very similarity that the clue to the solution of Mrs. Bendix's murder was to be found. I felt this so strongly that I somehow actually knew it. These intuitions do come to me sometimes, explain them as you will, and I have never yet known them fail me. This one did not do so either. I began to examine this case in the light of the Molyneux one. Would the latter help me to find the woman I was looking for in the former? What were the indications, so far as Barnett was concerned? Barnett received his fatal package because he was purposing to marry a girl whom the murderer was resolved he should not marry. With so many parallels between the two cases already, was there— Mrs. Fielder Fleming pushed back her unwieldy hat to a still more unbecoming angle, and looked deliberately round the table with the air of an early Christian trying the power of the human eye on a doubtfully intimidated covey of lions. Was there another here? This time Mrs. Fielder Fleming was rewarded with several real and audible gasps. That of Sir Charles was quite the most audible, an outraged, indignant gasp that came perilously near to a snort. Mr. Chitterwick gasped apprehensively, as if fearing something like a physical sequel to the sharp exchange of glances between Sir Charles and Mrs. Fielder Fleming, those of the former positively menacing in their warning, those of the lady almost vocal with her defiance of it. The chairman gasped too, wondering what a chairman should do if two members of his circle, and of opposite sexes at that, should proceed to blows under his very nose. Mr. Bradley forgot himself so far as to gasp as well, in sheer blissful ecstasy. Mrs. Fielder Fleming looked as if she were to prove a better hand at bull-baiting than himself, but Mr. Bradley did not grudge her the honour so long as he was to be allowed to sit and hug himself in the audience. Not in his most daring toreador-like antics would Mr. Bradley have ever dared to postulate the very daughter of his victim as the cause of the murder itself. Could this magnificent woman really bring forward a case to support so puncturing an idea? And what if it should actually turn out to be true? After all, such a thing was conceivable enough. Murders have been committed for the sake of lovely ladies often enough before, so why not for the lovely daughter of a pompous old silk? Oh, God! Oh, Montreal! Finally, Mrs. Fielder Fleming gasped too, at herself. Alone without a gasp sat Alicia Dammers, her face alight with nothing but an intellectual interest in the development of her fellow member's argument, determinedly impersonal. One was to gather that to Miss Dammers it was immaterial whether her own mother had been mixed up in the murder, so long as her part in it had provided opportunities for the sharpening of wits and the stimulation of intelligence. Without ever acknowledging her recognition that a personal element was being introduced into the Circle's investigations, she yet managed to radiate the idea that Sir Charles ought, if anything, to be detachedly delighted at the possibility of such enterprise on the part of his daughter. Sir Charles, however, was far from delighted. From the red swelling of the veins on his forehead, it was obvious that something was going to burst out of him in a very few seconds. Mrs. Fielder Fleming leapt, like an agitated but determined hen, for the gap. "We have agreed to waive the law of slander here," she almost squawked. "Personalities don't exist for us. If the name crops up of anyone personally known to us, we utter it as unflinchingly, in whatever connection, as if it were a complete stranger's. That is the definite arrangement we came to last night, Mr. President, isn't it? We are to do what we conceive to be our duty to society, quite irrespective of any personal considerations." For a moment, Roger indulged his tremors. He did not want his beautiful circle to explode in a cloud of dust, never again to be reunited. And though he could not but admire the flurried but undaunted courage of Mrs. Fielder Fleming, he had to be content to envy it so far as Sir Charles was concerned, for he certainly did not possess anything like it himself. On the other hand, there was no doubt that the lady had right on her side, and what can any president do but administer justice? "Perfectly correct, Mrs. Fielder Fleming," he had to admit, hoping his voice sounded as firm as he would have wished. For a moment, a blue glare emanating from Sir Charles enveloped him luridly. Then, as Mrs. Fielder Fleming, evidently heartened by this official support, took up her bomb again, the rays of the glare were switched again onto her. Roger, nervously watching the two of them, could not help reflecting that blue rays are things which should never be directed onto bombs. Mrs. Fielder Fleming juggled featly with her bomb. Often, though it seemed about to slip through her fingers, it never quite reached the ground or detonated. "Very well, then. I will go on. My triangle now had the second of its members. On the analogy of the Barnet murder, where was the third to be found? Obviously, with Molyneux as the prototype, in some person who was anxious to prevent the first member from marrying the second. So far, you will see, I am not out of harmony with the conclusions Sir Charles gave us last night, though my method of arriving at them was perhaps somewhat different. He gave us a triangle also, without expressly defining it as such, perhaps even without recognizing it as such. And the first two members of his triangle are precisely the same as the first two of mine." Here Mrs. Fielder Fleming made a notable effort to return something of Sir Charles's glare in defiant challenge to contradiction. As she had simply stated a plain fact, however, which Sir Charles was quite unable to refute, without explaining that he had not meant what he had meant the evening before, the challenge passed unanswered. Also, the glare visibly diminished, but for all that, patently remarked Sir Charles's expression, "A triangle by any other name does not smell so unsavoury." "It is when we come to the third member," pursued Mrs. Fielder Fleming with renewed poise, "that we are at variance. Sir Charles suggested to us Lady Pennefather. I have not the pleasure of Lady Pennefather's acquaintance, but Miss Dammers, who knows her well, tells me that in almost every particular the estimate given us by Sir Charles of her character was wrong. She is neither mean, grasping, greedy, nor in any imaginable way capable of the awful deed with which Sir Charles, perhaps a little rashly, was ready to credit her. Lady Pennefather, I understand, is a particularly sweet and kindly woman, somewhat broad-minded, no doubt, but none the worse for that. Indeed, as some of us would think, a good deal the better." Mrs. Fielder Fleming encouraged the belief that she was not merely tolerant of a little harmless immorality, but actually ready to act as godmother to any particular instance of it. Indeed, she went sometimes quite a long detour out of her way in order to propagate this belief among her friends. But unfortunately, her friends would persist in remembering that she had refused to have anything more to do with one of her own nieces since the latter, on learning that her middle-aged husband kept, for purposes of convenience, a different mistress in each of the 4 quarters of England, and just to be on the safe side, one in Scotland too, had run away with a young man of her own with whom she happened to be very devotedly in love. Just as I differ from Sir Charles over the identity of the third person in the triangle, went on Mrs. Fielder Fleming, happily ignorant of her friend's memories, so I differ from him in the means by which that identity is to be established. We are at complete variance in our ideas regarding the very heart of the problem, the motive. Sir Charles would have us think that this was a murder committed, or attempted rather, for gain. I am convinced that the incentive was, at any rate, a less ignoble one than that. Murder, we are taught, can never be really justifiable, but there are occasions when it comes dangerously near it. This, in my opinion, was one of them. It is in the character of Sir Eustace himself that I see the clue to the identity of the third person. Let us consider it for a moment. We are not restricted by any considerations of slander, and we can say at once that, from certain points of view, Sir Eustace is a quite undesirable member of the community. From the point of view of a young man, for the sake of example, who is in love with a girl, Sir Eustace must be one of the very last persons with whom the young man would wish that girl to come into contact. He is not merely immoral, he is without excuse for his immorality, a far more serious thing. He is a rake, a spendthrift, without honor or scruples where women are concerned, and a man, moreover, who has already made a mess of marriage with a very charming woman, and one by no means too narrow to overlook even a more than liberal allowance of the usual male peccadilloes and lapses. As a prospective husband for any young girl, Sir Eustace Pennefather is a tragedy. And as a prospective husband for a young girl whom a man loves with all his heart, intoned Mrs. Fielder Fleming very solemnly, it is easy to conceive that, in that particular man's regard, Sir Eustace Pennefather becomes nothing short of an impossibility. And a man who is a man, added Mrs. Fielder Fleming, quite mauve with intensity, does not admit impossibilities. She paused, pregnantly. Curtain, Act 1, confided Mr. Bradley behind his hand to Mr. Ambrose Chitterwick. Mr. Chitterwick smiled nervously. Chapter 8. Sir Charles took the usual advantage of the first interval to rise from his seat. Like so many of us in these days, by the time of the first interval, when it is not a play of Mrs. Fielder Fleming's that is in question, he felt almost physically unable to contain himself longer. Mr. President, he boomed, let us get this clear. Is Mrs. Fielder Fleming making the preposterous accusation that some friend of my daughter's is responsible for this crime, or is she not? The President looked somewhat helplessly up at the bulk towering wrathfully above him and wished he were anything but the President. I really don't know, Sir Charles, he professed, which was not only feeble but untrue. Mrs. Fielder Fleming, however, was by now quite able to speak up for herself. I have not yet specifically accused anyone of the crime, Sir Charles, she said, with a cold dignity that was only marred by the fact that her hat, which had apparently been sharing its mistress's emotions, was now perched rakishly over her left ear. So far, I have been simply developing a thesis. To Mr. Bradley, Sir Charles would have replied, with Johnsonian scorn of evasion, Sir, damn your thesis. Hampered now by the puerilities of civilized convention regarding polite intercourse between the sexes, he could only summon up once more the blue glare. With the unfairness of her sex, Mrs. Fielder Fleming promptly took advantage of his handicap. And, she added pointedly, I have not yet finished doing so. Sir Charles sat down, the perfect allegory, but he grunted very naughtily to himself as he did so. Mr. Bradley restrained an impulse to clap Mr. Chitterwick on the back and then chuck him under the chin. Her serenity so natural as to be patently artificial, Mrs. Fielder Fleming proceeded to call the interval closed and ring up the curtain on her second act. Having given you my processes towards arriving at the identity of the third member of the triangle, I postulated, in other words towards that of the murderer, I will go on to the actual evidence and show how that supports my conclusions. Did I say supports? I meant confirms them beyond all doubt. But what are your conclusions, Mrs. Fielder Fleming? Bradley asked, with an air of bland interest. You haven't defined them yet. You only hinted that the murderer was a rival of Sir Eustace's for the hand of Miss Wildman. Exactly, agreed Alessia Dammers. Even if you don't want to tell us the man's name yet, Mabel, can't you narrow it down a little more for us? Miss Dammers disliked vagueness. It savoured to her of the slipshod, which above all things in this world she detested. Moreover, she really was extremely interested to know upon whom Mrs. Fielder Fleming's choice had alighted. Mabel, she knew, might look like one sort of fool, talk like another sort, and behave like a third, and yet really she was not a fool at all. But Mabel was determined to be coy. Not yet, I'm afraid. For certain reasons I want to prove my case first. You'll understand later, I think. Very well, sighed Miss Dammers. But let's keep away from the detective story atmosphere. All we want to do is to solve this difficult case, not mystify each other. I have my reasons, Alicia, frowned Mrs. Fielder Fleming, and rather obviously proceeded to collect her thoughts. Where was I? Oh yes, the evidence. Now this is very interesting. I have succeeded in obtaining two pieces of quite vital evidence which I have never heard brought forward before. The first is that Sir Eustace was not in love with— Mrs. Fielder Fleming hesitated. Then, as the plunge had already been taken for her, followed the intrepid Mr. Bradley into the deeps of complete candour. With Miss Wildman at all. He intended to marry her simply for her money, or rather, for what he hoped to get of her father's money. I hope, Sir Charles, added Mrs. Fielder Fleming frostily, that you will not consider me slanderous if I allude to the fact that you are an exceedingly rich man. It has a most important bearing on my case. Sir Charles inclined his massive, handsome head. It is hardly a matter of slander, madam. Simply one of taste, which is outside my professional orbit. I fear it would be a waste of time for me to attempt to advise you on it. That is very interesting, Mrs. Fielder Fleming. Roger hastily interposed on this exchange of pleasantries. How did you discover it? From Sir Eustace's man, Mr. Sheringham, replied Mrs. Fielder Fleming, not without pride. I interrogated him. Sir Eustace had made no secret of it. He seems to confide most freely in his man. He expected, apparently, to be able to pay off his debts, buy a racehorse or two, provide for the present Lady Pennefather, and generally make a fresh and no doubt discreditable start. He had actually promised Barker, that is his man's name, a present of £100 on the day he led the little filly to the altar, as he phrased it. I am sorry to hurt your feelings, Sir Charles, but I have to deal with facts, and feelings must go down before them. A present of £10 bought me all the information I wanted. Quite remarkable information, as it turned out. She looked round triumphantly. You don't think, perhaps, ventured Mr. Chitterwick with an apologetic smile, that information from such a tainted source might not be entirely reliable? The source seems so very tainted. Why, I don't think my own man would sell me for a £10 note. Like master, like man, returned Mrs. Fielder Fleming shortly. His information was perfectly reliable. I was able to check nearly everything he told me, so that I think I am entitled to accept the small residue as correct too. I should like to quote another of Sir Eustace's confidences. It is not pretty, but it is very, very illuminating. He had made an attempt to seduce Miss Wildman in a private room at the Pugdog restaurant, that, for instance, I checked later, apparently with the object of ensuring the certainty of the marriage he desired. I am sorry again, Sir Charles, but these facts must be brought out. I had better say at once that the attempt was unsuccessful. That night, Sir Eustace remarked, and to his valet of all people, remember, "You can take a filly to the altar, but you can't make her drunk." That, I think, will show you better than any words of mine just what manner of man Sir Eustace Pennefather is. And it will also show you how overwhelmingly strong was the incentive of the man who really loved her to put her forever out of the reach of such a brute. And that brings me to the second piece of my evidence. This is really the foundation stone of the whole structure, the basis on which the necessity for murder, as the murderer saw it, rested, and the basis, at the same time, of my own reconstruction of the crime. Miss Wildman was hopelessly, unreasonably, irrevocably infatuated with Sir Eustace Pennefather. As an artist in dramatic effect, Mrs. Fielder Fleming was silent for a moment to allow the significance of this information to sink into the minds of her audience. But Sir Charles was far too personally preoccupied to be interested in significances. "And may one ask how you found that out, madam?" he demanded, swelling with sarcasm. "From my daughter's maid?" "From your daughter's maid," responded Mrs. Fielder Fleming sweetly. "Detecting, I discover, is an expensive hobby, but one mustn't regret money spent in a good cause." Roger sighed. It was plain that once this ill-fortuned child of his invention had died a painful death, the circle, if it had not been completely squared by then, would be found to be without either Mrs. Fielder Fleming or Sir Charles Wildman, and he knew which of the two it would be. It was a pity. Sir Charles, besides being such an asset from the professional point of view, was the only leavening apart from Mr. Ambrose Chitterwick of the literary element, and Roger, who had attended a few literary parties in his earlier days, was quite sure he would not be able to face a gathering that consisted of nothing but people who made their livings by their typewriters. Besides, Mrs. Fielder Fleming really was being a little hard on the old man. After all, it was his daughter who was in question. "I have now," said Mrs. Fielder Fleming, "established an overwhelming motive for the man who is in my mind to eliminate Sir Eustace. In fact, it must have seemed to him the only possible way out of an intolerable situation. Let me now go on to connect him with the few facts allowed us by the anonymous murderer. When the Chief Inspector the other evening permitted us to examine the forged letter from Mason and Sons, I examined it closely, because I know something about typewriters. That letter was typed on a Hamilton machine. The man I have in mind has a Hamilton typewriter at his place of business. You may say that might be only a coincidence, the Hamilton being so generally used. So it might. But if you get enough coincidences lumped together, they cease to become coincidences at all and become certainties. In the same way, we have the further coincidence of Mason's notepaper. This man has a definite connection with Mason's. 3 years ago, as you may remember, Masons were involved in a big lawsuit. I forget the details, but I think they brought an action against one of their rivals. You may remember, Sir Charles." Sir Charles nodded reluctantly, as if unwilling to help his antagonist even with this unimportant information. "I ought to," he said shortly. "It was against the Fernley Chocolate Company for infringement of copyright in an advertisement figure. I led for Masons." "Thank you. Yes, I thought it was something like that. Very well, then. This man was connected with that very case. He was helping Masons on the legal side. He must have been in and out of their office. His opportunities for possessing himself of a piece of their notepaper would have been legion. The chances by which he might have found himself 3 years later in possession of a piece would be innumerable. The paper had yellowed edges. It must have been quite 3 years old. It had an erasure. That erasure, I suggest, is the remains of a brief note on the case jotted down one day in Mason's office. The thing is obvious. Everything fits. Then there is the matter of the postmark. I agree with Sir Charles that we may take it for granted that the murderer, cunning though he is, and anxious though he might be to establish an alibi, would not entrust the posting of the fatal parcel to anyone else. Apart from a confederate, which I am sure we may rule out of the question, it would be far too dangerous. The name of Sir Eustace Pennefather could hardly escape being seen, and the connection later established. The murderer, secure in his conviction that suspicion will never fall on himself of all people, just like all murderers that have ever been, gambles a possible alibi against a certain risk and posts the thing himself. It is therefore advisable, just to clinch the case against him, to connect the man with the neighbourhood of the Strand between the hours of 8:30 and 9:30 on that particular evening. Surprisingly enough, I found this task, which I had expected to be the most difficult, the easiest of all. The man of whom I am thinking actually attended a public dinner that night at the Hotel Cecil, a reunion dinner to be exact of his old school. The Hotel Cecil, I need not remind you, is almost opposite Southampton Street. The Southampton Street post office is the nearest one to the hotel. What could be easier for him than to slip out of his seat for the 5 minutes, which is all that would be required, and be back again almost before his neighbours had noticed his action? "What indeed?" murmured the rapt Mr. Bradley. "I have two final points to make. You remember that in pointing out the resemblance of this case to the Molyneux affair, I remarked that this similarity was more than surprising, it was significant. I will explain what I meant by that. What I meant was that the parallel was far too close for it to be just a coincidence. This case is a deliberate copy of that one. And if it is, there is only one inference. This murder is the work of a man steeped in criminal history, of a criminologist, and the man I have in mind is a criminologist. My last point concerns the denial in the newspaper of the rumoured engagement between Sir Eustace Pennefather and Miss Wildman. I learnt from his valet that Sir Eustace did not send that denial himself, nor did Miss Wildman. Sir Eustace was furiously angry about it. It was sent, on his own initiative, without consulting either of them, by the man whom I am accusing of having committed this crime. Mr. Bradley stopped hugging himself for a moment. And the nitrobenzene? Were you able to connect him with that too? That is one of the very few points on which I agree with Sir Charles. I don't think it in the least necessary or possible to connect him with such a common commodity, which can be bought anywhere without the slightest difficulty or remark. Mrs. Fielder Fleming was holding herself in with a visible effort. Her words, so calm and judicial to read, had hitherto been spoken too with a strenuous attempt towards calm and judicial delivery. But with each sentence the attempt was obviously becoming more difficult. Mrs. Fielder Fleming was clearly getting so excited that a few more such sentences seemed likely to choke her, though to the others such intensity of feeling seemed a little unnecessary. She was approaching her climax, of course, but even that seemed hardly an excuse for such a very purple face and a hat that had now managed somehow to ride to the very back of her head, where it trembled agitatedly in sympathy with its mistress. "That is all," she concluded jerkily. "I submit that I have proved my case. This man is the murderer." There was complete silence. "Well," said Alicia Dammers impatiently, "who is he then?" Sir Charles, who had been regarding the orator with a frown that grew more and more lowering every minute, thumped quite menacingly on the table in front of him. "Precisely," he growled. "Let us get out in the open. Against whom are these ridiculous insinuations of yours directed, madam?" One gathered that Sir Charles did not find himself in agreement with the lady's conclusions, even before knowing what they were. "Accusations, Sir Charles," Mrs. Fielder Fleming squeaked correction. You pretend you don't know." "Really, madam," retorted Sir Charles with massive dignity, "I'm afraid I have no idea." And then Mrs. Fielder Fleming became regrettably dramatic, rising slowly to her feet like a tragedy queen, except that tragedy queens do not wear their hats tremblingly on the very backs of their heads, and if their faces are apt to go brilliant purple with emotion, disguise the tint with appropriate grease paints. Heedless of the chair overturning behind her with a dull, doom-like thud, her quivering finger pointing across the table, she confronted Sir Charles with every inch of her 5 foot nothing. "Thou!" shrilled Mrs. Fielder Fleming. "Thou art the man." Her outstretched finger shook like a ribbon on an electric fan. "The brand of Cain is on your forehead, murderer!" In the silence of ecstatic horror that followed, Mr. Bradley clung deliriously to the arm of Mr. Chitterwick. Sir Charles succeeded in finding his voice, temporarily mislaid. "The woman's mad," he gasped. Finding that she had not been shot on the spot, or even blasted by blue lightning from Sir Charles's eyes, either of which possibilities it seemed that she had been dreading, Mrs. Fielder Fleming proceeded rather less hysterically to amplify her charge. "No, I am not mad, Sir Charles. I am very, very sane. You loved your daughter, and with the twofold love that a man who has lost his wife feels for the only feminine thing left to him, you considered that any lengths were justified to prevent her from falling into the hands of Sir Eustace Pennefather, from having her youth, her innocence, her trust exploited by such a scoundrel. Out of your own mouth I convict you. Already you've told us that it was not necessary to mention everything that took place at your interview with Sir Eustace. No, for then you would have had to give away the fact that you informed him you would rather kill him with your own hands than see your daughter married to him. And when matters reach such a pass, what with the poor girl's infatuation and obstinacy, and Sir Eustace's determination to take advantage of them, that no means short of that very thing was left to you to prevent the catastrophe, you did not shrink from employing them. Sir Charles Wildman, may God be your judge, for I cannot. Breathing heavily, Mrs. Fielder Fleming retrieved her inverted chair and sat down on it. "Well, Sir Charles," remarked Mr. Bradley, whose swelling bosom was threatening to burst his waistcoat. "Well, I wouldn't have thought it of you. Murder, indeed. Very naughty. Very, very naughty." For once, Sir Charles took no notice of his faithful gadfly. It is doubtful whether he even heard him. Now that it had penetrated into his consciousness that Mrs. Fielder Fleming really intended her accusation in all seriousness and was not the victim of a temporary attack of insanity, his bosom was swelling just as tumultuously as Mr. Bradley's. His face, adopting the purple tinge that Mrs. Fielder Fleming's was relinquishing, took on the aspect of the frog in the fable who failed to realize his own bursting point. Roger, whose emotions on hearing Mrs. Fielder Fleming's outburst had been so mixed as to be almost scrambled, began to feel quite alarmed for him. But Sir Charles found the safety valve of speech just in time. "Mr. President," he exploded through it, "if I am not right in assuming this to be a jest on this lady's part, even though a jest in the worst possible taste, am I to be expected to take this preposterous nonsense seriously?" Roger glanced at Mrs. Fielder Fleming's face, now set in flinty masses, and gulped. However, preposterous though Sir Charles might term it, his antagonist had certainly made out a case, and not a flimsy, unsupported case either. "I think," he said, as carefully as he could, "that if it had been anyone but yourself in question, Sir Charles, you would agree that a charge of this kind, when there is real evidence to support it, does at least require to be taken seriously, so far as to need refuting." Sir Charles snorted, and Mrs. Fielder Fleming nodded her head several times with vehemence. "If refuting is possible," observed Mr. Bradley. "But I must admit that, personally, I am impressed. Mrs. Fielder Fleming seems to me to have made out her case. Would you like me to go and telephone for the police, Mr. President?" He spoke with an air of earnest endeavour to do his duty as a citizen, however distasteful it might be. Sir Charles glared, but once more seemed bereft of words. "Not yet, I think," Roger said gently. "We haven't heard yet what Sir Charles has to answer." "Well, I suppose we may as well hear him," conceded Mr. Bradley. 5 pairs of eyes glued themselves on Sir Charles, 5 pairs of ears were strained. But Sir Charles, struggling mightily with himself, was silent. "As I expected," murmured Mr. Bradley. "There is no defence. Even Sir Charles, who has snatched so many murderers from the rope, can find nothing to say in such a glaring case. It's very sad." From the look he flashed at his tormentor, it was to be deduced that Sir Charles might have found plenty to say had the two of them been alone together. As it was, he could only rumble. "Mr. President," said Alicia Dammers, with her usual brisk efficiency, "I have a proposal to make. Sir Charles appears to be admitting his guilt by default, and Mr. Bradley, as a good citizen, wishes to hand him over to the police." "Hear, hear," observed the good citizen. "Personally, I should be sorry to do that. I think there is a good deal to be said for Sir Charles. Murder, we are taught, is invariably antisocial. But is it? I am of the opinion that Sir Charles's intention, that of ridding the world, and incidentally his own daughter, of Sir Eustace Pennefather, was quite in the world's best interests. That his intention miscarried, and an innocent victim was killed, is quite beside the point. Even Mrs. Fielder Fleming seemed to be doubtful whether Sir Charles ought to be condemned, as a jury would certainly condemn him, though she added in conclusion that she did not feel competent to judge him. I differ from her. Being a person of, I hope, reasonable intelligence, I feel perfectly competent to judge him. And I consider further that all 5 of us are competent to judge him. I therefore suggest that we do in fact judge him ourselves. Mrs. Fielder Fleming could act as prosecutor. Somebody, I propose Mr. Bradley, could defend him, and all 5 of us constitute a jury, the finding to be by majority in favor or against. We would bind ourselves to abide by the result, and if it is against him, we send for the police. If it is in his favor, we agree never to breathe a word of his guilt outside this room. May this be put to the meeting." Roger smiled at her reprovingly. He knew quite well that Miss Dammers no more believed in Sir Charles's guilt than he, Roger, did himself, and he knew that she was only pulling that eminent counsel's leg, a little cruelly, but no doubt she thought it was good for him. Miss Dammers professed herself a strong believer in seeing the other side, and held that it would be a very good thing for the cat occasionally to find itself chased by the mouse. Certainly, therefore, it was most salutary for a man who had prosecuted other men for their lives to find himself for once in the dock on just such a terrifying charge. Mr. Bradley, on the other hand, though he too obviously did not believe that Sir Charles was the murderer, mocked not out of conviction, but because only so could he get a little of his own back against Sir Charles for having made more of a success of his life than Mr. Bradley was likely to do. Nor, Roger thought, had Mr. Chitterwick any serious doubts as to the possibility of Sir Charles being guilty, though he was still looking so alarmed at Mrs. Fielder Fleming's temerity in suggesting such a thing that it was not altogether possible to say what he did think. Indeed, Roger was quite sure that nobody entertained the least suspicion of Sir Charles's innocence except Mrs. Fielder Fleming, and perhaps, from the look of him, Sir Charles himself. As that outraged gentleman had pointed out, such an idea, looked at in sober reflection, was plainly the most preposterous nonsense. Sir Charles could not be guilty because he was Sir Charles, and because such things don't happen, and because he obviously couldn't be. On the other hand, Mrs. Fielder Fleming had very neatly proved that he was, and Sir Charles had not even attempted yet to prove that he wasn't. Not for the first time, Roger wished, very sincerely, that anybody was sitting in the presidential chair but himself. "I think," he now repeated, "that before we take any steps at all, we ought to hear what Sir Charles has to say. I am sure," added the president kindly, remembering the right phrase, "that he will have a complete answer to all charges." He looked expectantly towards the criminal. Sir Charles appeared to jerk himself out of the haze of his wrath. "I am really expected to defend myself against this hysteria?" he barked. "Very well. I admit I am a criminologist, which Mrs. Fielder Fleming appears to think so damning. I admit that I attended a dinner at the Hotel Cecil on that night, which it seems is enough to put the rope round my neck. I admit, since it appears that my private affairs are to be dragged into public, regardless of taste or decency, that I would rather have strangled Sir Eustace with my own hands than see him married to my daughter." He paused and passed his hand rather wearily over his high forehead. He was no longer formidable, but only a rather bewildered old man. Roger felt intensely sorry for him, but Mrs. Fielder Fleming had stated her case too well for it to be possible to spare him. "I admit all this, but none of it is evidence that would have very much weight in a court of law. If you want me to prove that I did not actually send those chocolates, what am I to say? I could bring my 2 neighbors at the dinner, who would swear that I never left my seat till, it must have been after 10 o'clock. I can prove by means of other witnesses that my daughter finally consented, on my representations, to give up the idea of marriage with Sir Eustace, and has gone voluntarily to stay with relations of ours in Devonshire for a considerable time. But there again, I have to admit that this has happened since the date of posting the chocolates. In short, Mrs. Fielder Fleming has managed, with considerable skill, to put together a prima facie case against me. Though it was based on a mistaken assumption, I would point out to her that counsel is never constantly in and out of his client's premises, but meets him usually only in the presence of his solicitor, either at the former's place of business or in his own chambers. And I am quite ready, if this meeting thinks it advisable, for the matter to be investigated officially. More, I welcome such investigation in view of the slur that has been cast upon my name. Mr. President, I ask you, as representing the members as a whole, to take such action as you think fit." Roger steered a wary course. Speaking for myself, Sir Charles, I am quite sure that Mrs. Fielder Fleming's reasoning, exceedingly clever though it was, has been based, as you say, upon an error, and really, as a matter of mere probability, I cannot see a father sending poisoned chocolates to the would-be fiancée of his own daughter. A moment's thought would show him the practical inevitability of the chocolates reaching eventually the daughter herself. I have my own opinion about this crime, but even apart from that, I feel quite certain in my own mind that the case against Sir Charles has not really been proved. Mr. President, cut in Mrs. Fielder Fleming, not without heat, you may say what you like, but in the interests of— I agree, Mr. President, Miss Dammers interrupted incisively. It is unthinkable that Sir Charles could have sent those chocolates. Humph, said Mr. Bradley, unwilling to have his sport spoiled quite so soon. Here, Mr. Chitterwick with surprising decision. On the other hand, Roger pursued, I quite see that Mrs. Fielder Fleming is entitled to the official investigation which Sir Charles asks for, no less than is Sir Charles himself on behalf of his good name. And I agree with Sir Charles that she has certainly made out a prima facie case for investigation. But what I should like to stress is that so far only 2 members out of 6 have spoken, and it is not outside possibility that such startling developments may have been traced out by the time we have all had our turn, that the one we are discussing now may, I do not say that it will, but it may, have faded into insignificance. Oh ho, murmured Mr. Bradley. What has our worthy president got up his sleeve? I therefore propose, as a formal motion, Roger concluded, disregarding the somewhat sour looks cast on him by Mrs. Fielder Fleming, that we shelve the question regarding Sir Charles entirely, for discussion or report either inside or outside this room, for 1 week from today, when any member who wishes may bring it up again for decision, failing which it passes into oblivion for good and all. Shall we vote on that? Those in favour? The motion was carried unanimously. Mrs. Fielder Fleming would have liked to vote against it, but she had never yet belonged to any committee where all motions were not carried unanimously, and habit was too strong for her. The meeting then adjourned, rather oppressed. Chapter 9. Roger sat on the table in Moresby's room at Scotland Yard and swung his legs moodily. Moresby was being no help at all. I've told you, Mr. Sheringham, said the Chief Inspector with a patient air. It's not a bit of good you trying to pump me. I've told you all we know here. I'd help you if I could, as you know. Roger snorted incredulously. But we're simply at a dead end. So am I, Roger grunted. And I don't like it. You'll soon get used to it, Mr. Sheringham, consoled Moresby, if you take on this sort of job often. I simply can't get any further, Roger lamented. In fact, I don't think I want to. I'm practically sure I've been working on the wrong tack altogether. If the clue really does lie in Sir Eustace's private life, he's shielding it like the very devil. But I don't think it does. Humph, said Moresby, who did. I've cross-examined his friends till they're tired of the sight of me. I've cadged introductions to the friends of his friends, and the friends of his friends of his friends, and cross-examined them too. I've haunted his club, and what have I discovered? That Sir Eustace was not only a daisy, as you'd told me already, but a perfectly indiscreet daisy at that. The quite unpleasant type, fortunately very much rarer than women suppose, that talks of his feminine successes, with names, though I think that in Sir Eustace's case this was simply through lack of imagination and not any natural caddishness. But you see what I mean. I've collected the names of scores of women, and they all lead nowhere. If there is a woman at the bottom of it, I should have been sure to have heard of her by this time, and I haven't. And what about that American case, which we thought such an extraordinary parallel, Mr. Sheringham? That was cited last night by one of our members, said Roger gloomily, and a very pretty little deduction she drew from it. Ah, yes, nodded the Chief Inspector. That would be Mrs. Fielder Fleming, I suppose. She thinks Sir Charles Wildman is the guilty party, doesn't she? Roger stared at him. How the devil did you know that? Oh, the unscrupulous old hag. She passed you the wink, did she? Certainly not, sir, retorted Moresby with a virtuous air, as if half the difficult cases Scotland Yard solves are not edged in the first place along the right path by means of information received. She hasn't said a word to us, though I'm not saying it wouldn't have been her duty to do so. But there isn't much that your members are doing which we don't know about, and thinking too, for that matter. We're being shadowed, said Roger, pleased. Yes, you told me at the beginning that we were to have an eye kept on us. Well, well. So in that case, are you going to arrest Sir Charles? Not yet, I think, Mr. Sheringham, Moresby returned gravely. What do you think of the theory, then? She made out a very striking case for it. I should be very surprised, said Moresby with care, to be convinced that Sir Charles Wildman had taken to murdering people himself instead of preventing us from hanging other murderers. Less paying, certainly, Roger agreed. Yes, of course there can't be anything in it really, but it's a nice idea. And what theory are you going to put forward, Mr. Sheringham? Moresby? I haven't the faintest idea, and I've got to speak tomorrow night, too. I suppose I can fake up something to pass muster, but it's a disappointment. Roger reflected for a moment. I think the real trouble is that my interest in this case is simply academic. In all the others it has been personal, and that not only gives one such a much bigger incentive to get to the bottom of a case, but somehow actually helps one to do so. Bigger gleanings in the way of information, I suppose, and more intimate sidelights on the people concerned. Well, Mr. Sheringham, remarked Moresby, a little maliciously, perhaps you'll admit now that we people here, whose interest is never personal, if you mean by that looking at a case from the inside instead of from the outside, have a bit of an excuse when we do come to grief over a case. Which, by the way, Moresby added with professional pride, is precious seldom. I certainly do, Roger agreed feelingly. Well, Moresby, I've got to go through the distressing business of buying a new hat before lunch. Do you feel like shadowing me to Bond Street? I might afterwards walk into a neighbouring hostelry, and it would be nice for you to be able to shadow me in there too. Sorry, Mr. Sheringham, said Chief Inspector Moresby pointedly, but I have some work to do. Roger removed himself. He was feeling so depressed that he took a taxi to Bond Street instead of a bus to cheer himself up. Roger, having been in London occasionally during the war years and remembering the interesting habits cultivated by taxi drivers during that period, had never taken one since when a bus would do as well. The public memory is notoriously short, but the public's prejudices are equally notoriously long. Roger had reason for his depression. He was, as he had told Moresby, not only at a dead end, but the conviction was beginning to grow in him that he had actually been working completely on the wrong lines, and the possibility that all the labour he had put into the case had simply been time wasted was a sad one. His initial interest in the affair, though great, had been, as he had just realized, only an academic one, such as he would feel in any cleverly planned murder. And in spite of the contacts established with persons who were acquainted with various of the protagonists, he still felt himself awkwardly outside the case. There was no personal connection somehow to enable him really to get to grips with it. He was beginning to suspect that it was the sort of case necessitating endless inquiries, such as a private individual has neither the skill, the patience, nor the time to prosecute, which can really only be handled by the official police. It was hazard, 2 chance encounters that same day, and almost within an hour, which put an entirely different complexion on the case to Roger's eyes, and translated at last his interest in it from the academic into the personal. The first was in Bond Street. Emerging from his hat shop, the new hat at just the right angle on his head, he saw bearing down on him Mrs. Vereker le Mesurier. Mrs. Vereker le Mesurier was small, exquisite, rich, comparatively young, and a widow, and she coveted Roger. Why, even Roger, who had his share of proper conceit, could not understand, but whenever he gave her the opportunity she would sit at his feet, metaphorically, of course. He had no intention of giving her the opportunity to do so, literally, and gaze up at him with her big brown eyes melting in earnest uplift. But she talked. She talked, in short, and talked and talked. And Roger, who rather liked talking himself, could not bear it. He tried to dart across the road, but there was no opening in the traffic stream. He was cornered. With a gay smile that masked a vituperative mind, he spoilt the angle of his beautiful new hat. Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier fastened on him gladly. "Oh, Mr. Sheringham, just the very person I wanted to see. Mr. Sheringham, do tell me, in the strictest confidence, of course, are you taking up this dreadful business of poor Joan Bendix's death? Oh, don't tell me you're not." Roger tried to tell her that he had hoped to do so, but she gave him no chance. "Oh, aren't you really? But it's too dreadful. You really ought to try and find out who sent those chocolates to Sir Eustace Pennefather. I do think it's naughty of you not to." Roger, the frozen grin of civilized intercourse on his face, again tried to edge a word in, without result. "I was horrified when I heard of it. Simply horrified." Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier registered horror. "You see, Joan and I were such very close friends, quite intimate. In fact, we were at school together. Did you say anything, Mr. Sheringham?" Roger, who had allowed a faintly incredulous groan to escape him, hastily shook his head. "And the awful thing, the truly terrible thing, is that Joan brought the whole thing on herself. Isn't that appalling, Mr. Sheringham?" Roger no longer wanted to escape. "What did you say?" he managed to insert, again incredulously. "I suppose it's what they call tragic irony," Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier chattered happily. "Certainly it was tragic enough, and I've never heard of anything so terribly ironical. You know about that bet she made with her husband, of course, so that he had to get her a box of chocolates, and if he hadn't, Sir Eustace would never have given him the poisoned ones, but would have eaten them and died himself, and from all I hear about him, good riddance. Well, Mr. Sheringham—" Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier lowered her voice to a conspirator-like whisper and glanced about her in the approved manner. "I've never told anyone else this, but I'm telling you because I know you'll appreciate it. You are interested in irony, aren't you?" "I adore it," Roger said mechanically. "Yes." "Well, Joan wasn't playing fair." "How do you mean?" Roger asked, bewildered. Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier was artlessly pleased with her sensation. "Why, she ought not to have made that bet at all. It was a judgment on her. A terrible judgment, of course, but the appalling thing is that she did bring it on herself in a way. I'm so terribly distressed about it. Really, Mr. Sheringham, I can hardly bear to turn the light out when I go to bed. I see Joan's face simply looking at me in the dark. It's awful." And for a fleeting instant, Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier's face did for once really mirror the emotion she professed. It looked quite haggard. "Why oughtn't Mrs. Bendix to have made the bet?" Roger asked patiently. "Oh, why? Because she'd seen the play before. We went together, the very first week it was on. She knew who the villain was all the time." "By Jove!" Roger was as impressed as Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier could have wished. "The avenging chance again, eh? We're none of us immune from it." "Poetic justice, you mean?" twittered Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier, to whom these remarks had been a trifle obscure. "Yes, it was, in a way, wasn't it? Though really, the punishment was out of all proportion to the crime. Good gracious, if every woman who cheats over a bet is to be killed for it, where would any of us be?" demanded Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier with unconscious frankness. "Umph," said Roger tactfully. Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier glanced rapidly up and down the pavement and moistened her lips. Roger had an odd impression that she was talking not as usual just for the sake of talking, but in some recondite way to escape from not talking. It was as if she was more distressed over her friend's death than she cared to show and found some relief in babbling. It interested Roger also to notice that fond, though she had probably been of the dead woman, she now found herself driven as if against her will to hint at blame even while praising her. It was as though she was able thus to extract some subtle consolation for the actual death. "But Joan Bendix of all people. That's what I can't get over, Mr. Sheringham. I should never have thought Joan would do a thing like that. Joan was such a nice girl. A little close with money, perhaps, considering how well off she was, but that isn't anything. Of course, I know it was only fun and pulling her husband's leg, But I always used to think Joan was such a serious girl, if you know what I mean." "Quite," said Roger, who could understand plain English as well as most people. "I mean, ordinary people don't talk about honor and truth and playing the game and all those things one takes for granted. But Joan did. She was always saying that this wasn't honorable or that wouldn't be playing the game. Well, she paid herself for not playing the game, poor girl, didn't she? Still, I suppose it all goes to prove the truth of the old saying." "What old saying?" asked Roger, almost hypnotized by this flow. "Why, that still waters run deep. Joan must have been deep after all, I'm afraid." Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier sighed. It was evidently a grave social error to be deep. "Not that I want to say anything against her now she's dead, poor darling, but, well, what I mean is, I do think psychology is so very interesting, don't you, Mr. Sheringham?" "Quite fascinating," Roger agreed gravely. "Well, I'm afraid I must be—" "And what does that man, Sir Eustace Pennefather, think about it all?" demanded Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier with an expression of positive vindictiveness. "After all, he's as responsible for Joan's death as anybody." "Oh, really?" Roger had not conceived any particular love for Sir Eustace, but he felt constrained to defend him against this charge. "Really, I don't think you can say that, Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier." "I can, and I do," affirmed that lady. "Have you ever met him, Mr. Sheringham? I hear he's a horrible creature, always running after some woman or other, and when he's tired of her just drops her, biff, like that. Is it true?" "I'm afraid I can't tell you," Roger said coldly. "I don't know him at all." "Well, it's common talk who he's taken up with now," retorted Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier, perhaps a trifle more pink than the delicate aids to nature on her cheeks would have warranted. "Half a dozen people have told me. That Bryce woman, of all people. You know, the wife of the oil man, or petrol, or whatever he made his money in." "I've never heard of her," Roger said, quite untruthfully. "It began about a week ago, they say," rattled on this red-hot gossiper. "To console himself for not getting Dora Wildman, I suppose. Well, thank goodness Sir Charles had the sense to put his foot down there. He did, didn't he? I heard so the other day. Horrible man. You'd have thought that such a dreadful thing as being practically responsible for poor Joan's death would have sobered him up a little, wouldn't you? But not a bit of it. As a matter of fact, I believe he—" "Have you seen any shows lately?" Roger asked in a loud voice. Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier stared at him for a moment nonplussed. "Shows? Yes, I've seen almost everything, I think. Why, Mr. Sheringham?" "I just wondered. The new review at the pavilion's quite good, isn't it? Well, I'm afraid I must—" "Oh, don't." Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier shuddered delicately. "I was there the night before Joan's death." Can no subject take us away from that for a moment, thought Roger. Lady Cavilstoke had a box and asked me to join her party. Yes? Roger was wondering if it would be considered rude if he simply handed the lady off, as at Rugger, and dived for the nearest opening in the traffic. "Quite a good show," he said at random, edging restlessly towards the curb. "I like that sketch, the sempiternal triangle particularly." "The sempiternal triangle," repeated Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier vaguely. "Yes, quite near the beginning." "Oh, then I may not have seen it. I got there a few minutes late, I'm afraid." "But then," said Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier with pathos, "I always do seem to be late for everything." Roger noted mentally that the few minutes was by way of a euphemism, as were most of Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier's statements regarding herself. The sempiternal triangle had certainly not been in the first half-hour of the performance. "Ah." Roger looked fixedly at an oncoming bus. "I'm afraid you'll have to excuse me, Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier. There's a man on that bus who wants to speak to me." "Scotland Yard," he hissed, in an impressive whisper. "Oh, then does that mean you are looking into poor Joan's death, Mr. Sheringham? Do tell me. I won't breathe it to a soul." Roger looked round him with a mysterious air and frowned in the approved manner. "Yes," he nodded, his finger to his lips, "but not a word, Mrs. Vereker Le Mesurier." "Of course not. I promise." But Roger was disappointed to notice that the lady did not seem quite so impressed as he had hoped. From her expression, he was almost ready to believe that she suspected how unavailing his efforts had been, and was a little sorry that he had taken on more than he could manage. But the bus had now reached them, and with a hasty goodbye, Roger swung himself onto the step as it lumbered past. With awful stealth, feeling those big brown eyes fixed in awe on his back, he climbed the steps and took his seat, after an exaggerated scrutiny of the other passengers, beside a perfectly inoffensive little man in a bowler hat. The little man, who happened to be a clerk in the employment of a monumental mason at Tooting, looked at him resentfully. There were plenty of quite empty seats all round them. The bus swung into Piccadilly, and Roger got off at the Rainbow Club. He was lunching once again with a member. Roger had spent most of the last 10 days asking such members of the Rainbow Club, as he knew, however remotely, out to lunch in order to be asked to the club in return. So far, nothing helpful had arisen out of all this wasted labour, and he anticipated nothing more today. Not that the member was at all reluctant to talk about the tragedy. He had been at school with Bendix, it appeared, and was as ready to adopt responsibility for him on the strength of this tie as Mrs. Verica Le Mesurier had been for Mrs. Bendix. He plumed himself more than a little, therefore, on having a more intimate connection with the business than his fellow members. Indeed, one gathered that the connection was even a trifle closer than that of Sir Eustace himself. Roger's host was that kind of man. As they were talking, a man entered the dining room and walked past their table. Roger's host became abruptly silent. The newcomer threw him an abrupt nod and passed on. Roger's host leant forward across the table and spoke in the hushed tones of one to whom a revelation has been vouchsafed. "Talk of the devil, that was Bendix himself. First time I've seen him in here since it happened. Poor devil. It knocked him all to pieces, you know. I've never seen a man so devoted to his wife. It was a byword. Did you see how ghastly he looked?" All this in a tactful whisper that must have been far more obvious to the subject of it had he happened to be looking their way than the loudest bellowing. Roger nodded shortly. He had caught a glimpse of Bendix's face and been shocked by it even before he learned his identity. It was haggard and pale and seamed with lines of bitterness, prematurely old. Hang it all, he now thought, much moved. Somebody really must make an effort. If the murderer isn't found soon, it will kill that chap too. Aloud, he said, somewhat at random and certainly without tact, "He didn't exactly fall on your neck. I thought you two were such bosom friends." His host looked uncomfortable. "Oh, well, you must make allowances just at present," he hedged. "Besides, we weren't bosom friends exactly. As a matter of fact, he was a year or two senior to me. Or it might have been 3 even. We were in different houses too. And he was on the modern side, of course. Can you imagine the son of his father being anything else? While I was a classical bird." "I see," said Roger quite gravely, realizing that his host's actual contact with Bendix at school had been limited, at most, to that of the latter's toe with the former's hinder parts. He left it at that. For the rest of lunch, he was a little inattentive. Something was nagging at his brain, and he could not identify it. Somewhere, somehow, during the last hour, he felt, a vital piece of information had been conveyed to him, and he had never grasped its importance. It was not until he was putting on his coat half an hour later, and for the moment had given up trying to worry his mind into giving up its booty, that the realization suddenly came to him unbidden, in accordance with its usual and maddening way. He stopped dead, one arm in his coat sleeve, the other in act to fumble. "By Jove," he said softly. "Anything the matter, old man?" asked his host, now mellowed by much port. "No, thanks, nothing," said Roger hastily, coming to earth again. Outside the club he hailed a taxi. For probably the first time in her life, Mrs. Verica Le Mesurier had given somebody a constructive idea. For the rest of the day, Roger was very busy indeed. Chapter 10. The President called on Mr. Bradley to hold forth. Mr. Bradley stroked his moustache and mentally shot his cuffs. He had begun his career, when still Percy Robinson, as a motor salesman, and had discovered that there is more money in manufacturing. Now he manufactured detective stories and found his former experience of the public's gullibility not unhelpful. He was still his own salesman, but occasionally had difficulty in remembering that he was no longer mounted on a stand at Olympia. Everything and everybody in this world, including Morton Harrogate Bradley, he heartily despised, except only Percy Robinson. He sold in tens of thousands. "This is rather unfortunate for me," he began, in the correct gentlemanly drawl, as if addressing an audience of morons. "I had rather been under the impression that I should be expected to produce as a murderer the most unlikely person in the usual tradition, and Mrs. Fielder Fleming has cut the ground away from under my feet. I don't see how I can possibly find you a more unlikely murderer than Sir Charles here. All of us who have the misfortune to speak after Mrs. Fielder Fleming will have to be content to pile up so many anticlimaxes. Not that I haven't done my best. I studied the case according to my own lights, and it led me to a conclusion which certainly surprised myself quite a lot. But as I said, after the last speaker, it will probably seem to everybody else a dismal anticlimax. Let me see now. Where did I begin? Oh, yes, with the poison. Now, the use of nitrobenzene as the poisoning agent interested me quite a lot. I find it extremely significant. Nitrobenzene is the last thing one would expect inside those chocolates. I've made something of a study of poisons in connection with my work, and I've never heard of nitrobenzene being employed in a criminal case before. There are cases on record of its use in suicide and in accidental poisoning, but not more than 3 or 4 all told. I'm surprised that this point doesn't seem to have struck either of my predecessors. The really interesting thing is that so few people know nitrobenzene as a poison at all. Even the experts don't. I was speaking to a man who got a science scholarship at Cambridge and specialized in chemistry, and he had actually never heard of it as a poison. As a matter of fact, I found I knew a good deal more about it than he did. A commercial chemist would certainly never think of it as among the ordinary poisons. It isn't even listed as such, and the list is comprehensive enough. Well, all this seems most significant to me. Then there are other points about it. It's used most extensively in commerce. In fact, it's the kind of thing that might be used in almost any manufacture. It's a solvent, of quite a universal kind. We've been told that its chief use is in making aniline dyes. That may be the most important one, but it certainly isn't the most extensive. It's used a lot in confectionery, as we were also told, and in perfumery as well. But really, I can't attempt to give you a list of its uses. They range from chocolates to motorcar tires. The important thing is that it's perfectly easy to get hold of. For that matter, it's perfectly easy to make too. Any schoolboy knows how to treat benzol with nitric acid to get nitrobenzene. I've done it myself 100 times. The veriest smattering of chemical knowledge is all that's wanted, and nothing in the way of expensive apparatus. Or, so far as that goes, it could be done equally by somebody without any chemical knowledge at all. That is, the actual process of making it. Oh, and it could be made quite secretly, by the way. Nobody need even guess, but I think just a little chemical knowledge at any rate would be wanted, ever to set one about making it at all, at least for this particular purpose. Well, so far as the case as a whole was concerned, this use of nitrobenzene seemed to me not only the sole original feature, but by far the most important piece of evidence. Not in the way that prussic acid is valuable evidence for the reason that prussic acid is so hard to obtain, because once its use was determined, anybody could get hold of or make nitrobenzene. And that, of course, is a tremendous point in favor of it from the would-be murderer's point of view. No. What I mean is that the sort of person who would ever think of employing the stuff at all ought to be definable within surprisingly narrow limits. Mr. Bradley stopped a moment to light a cigarette, and if he was secretly pleased that his fellow members showed the extent to which he had engaged their interest by not uttering a word until he was ready to go on, he did not divulge the fact. Surveying them for a moment, as if inspecting a class composed entirely of half-wits, he took up his argument again. First of all, then, we can credit this user of nitrobenzene with a minimum at any rate of chemical knowledge. Or perhaps I ought to qualify that. Either chemical knowledge or specialized knowledge. A chemist's assistant, for instance, who was interested enough in his job to read it up after shop hours, would fit the bill for the first case, and a woman employed in a factory where nitrobenzene was used and where the employees had been warned against its poisonous properties would do for an example of the second. There are two kinds of person, it seems to me, who might think of using the stuff as a poison at all, and the first kind is subdivided into the two classes I've mentioned. But it's the second kind that I think we are much more probably dealing with in this crime. This is a more intelligent sort of person altogether. In this category, the chemist's assistant becomes an amateur dabbler in chemistry. The girl in the factory, a woman doctor, let us say, with an interest in toxicology. Or, to get away from the specialist, a highly intelligent lady with a strong interest in criminology, particularly on its toxicological side. Just, in fact, like Mrs. Fielder Fleming here. Mrs. Fielder Fleming gasped indignantly, and Sir Charles, though momentarily startled at the unexpected quarter from which was dealt this tit for the tats he had lately suffered at the gasping lady's hands, emitted the next instant a sound which from anybody else could only have been described as a guffaw. All of them, you understand, continued Mr. Bradley with complete serenity, the kind of people who might be expected not only to keep a tailor's medical jurisprudence on their shelves, but to consult it frequently. I agree with you. You see, Mrs. Fielder Fleming, that the method of this crime does show traces of criminological knowledge. You cited one case which was certainly a remarkable parallel. Sir Charles cited another, and I am going to cite yet a third. It is a regular jumble of old cases, and I am quite sure, as you are, that this is something more than a mere coincidence. I'd arrived at this conclusion myself, of criminological knowledge, before you mentioned it at all, and I was helped to it as well by the strong feeling that whoever sent those chocolates to Sir Eustace possesses a tailor. That is a pure guess, I admit, but in my copy of Taylor, the article on nitrobenzene occurs on the very next page after cyanide of potassium, and there seems to me food for thought there. The speaker paused a moment. Mr. Chitterwick nodded. I think I see. You mean anybody deliberately searching the pages for a poison that would fulfill certain requirements? Exactly, Mr. Bradley concurred. You lay great stress on this matter of the poison, Sir Charles remarked, almost genial. Do you tell us that you think you've identified the murderer by deductions drawn from this one point alone? No, Sir Charles, I don't think I can go quite so far as that. I lay so much stress on it because, as I said, it's the only really original feature of the crime. By itself, it won't solve the problem, but considered in conjunction with other features, I do think it should go a long way towards doing so. Or at any rate, provide such a check on a person suspected for other reasons as to turn suspicion into certainty. Let's look at it, for instance, in the light of the crime as a whole. I think the first thing one realizes is that this crime is the work not only of an intelligent person, but of a well-educated one too. Well, you see, that rules out at once the first division of people who might be expected to think of using nitrobenzene as the poisoning agent. Gone are our chemist's assistant and our factory girl. We can concentrate on our intelligent, well-educated person with an interest in criminology, some knowledge of toxicology, and, if I'm not very much mistaken, and I very seldom am, a copy of Taylor or some similar book on his or her shelves. That, my dear Watsons, is what the criminal's singular choice of nitrobenzene has to tell me. And Mr. Bradley stroked the growth on his upper lip with an offensive complacency that was not wholly assumed. Mr. Bradley took some pains to impress on the world how pleased he was with himself, but the pose was not without its foundation, in fact. Most ingenious, certainly, murmured Mr. Chitterwick, duly impressed. So now let's get on with it, observed Miss Dammers, not at all impressed. What's your theory? That is, if you've really got one. Oh, I've got one, all right. Mr. Bradley smiled in a superior manner. This was the first time he had succeeded in provoking Miss Dammers to snap at him, and he was rather pleased. But let's take things in their proper order. I want to show you how inevitably I was led to my conclusion, and I can only do that by tracing out my own footsteps, so to speak. Having made my deductions from the poison itself, then, I set about examining the other clues to see if they would lead me to a result that I could check by the other. First of all, I concentrated on the notepaper of the forged letter, the only really valuable clue apart from the poison. Now, this piece of notepaper puzzled me. For some reason, which I couldn't identify, the name of Masons seemed to strike a reminiscent note to me. I felt sure that I'd heard of Masons in some other connection than just through their excellent chocolates. At last, I remembered. I'm afraid I must touch here on the personal, and I apologize in advance, Sir Charles, for the lapse of taste. My sister, before she married, was a shorthand typist. Mr. Bradley's extreme languor all of a sudden indicated that he felt this connection needed some defense and was determined not to give it. The next instant he gave it. That is to say, her education put her on rather a different level from the usual shorthand typist, and she was, in point of fact, a trained secretary. She had joined an establishment run by a lady who supplied secretaries to business firms to take the places temporarily of girls in responsible positions who were ill or away on holiday or anything like that. Including my sister, there were only 2 or 3 girls at the place, and the posts they went to only lasted as a rule for 2 or 3 weeks. Each girl would therefore have a good many such posts in the course of a year. However, I did remember distinctly that one of the firms to which my sister went while she was there was Mason's, as temporary secretary to one of the directors. This seemed to me possibly useful. It wouldn't be likely that she could throw a sidelight on the murder, but at any rate she might be able to give me introductions to 1 or 2 members of Mason's staff if necessary, so I went down to see her about it. She remembered quite well. It was between 3 and 4 years ago, and she liked being there so much that she had thought quite seriously of putting in for a permanent secretaryship with the firm, should one be available. Naturally, she hadn't got to know any of the staff really well, but quite enough to give me the introductions if I wanted them. By the way, I happened to say to her casually, I saw the letter that was sent to Sir Eustace with the chocolates, and not only Mason's name, but the actual paper itself struck me as familiar. I suppose you wrote to me on it while you were there. I don't know that I ever did that, she said, but of course the paper was familiar to you. You've played paper games here often enough, haven't you? You know we always use it. It's such a convenient size. Paper games, I should explain, have always been a favorite thing in our family. It's funny how a connection will stick in the mind, but not the actual circumstances of it. Of course, I remembered then at once. There was quite a pile of the paper in one of the drawers of my sister's writing table. I'd often torn it into strips for our paper games myself. But how did you get hold of it? I asked her. It seemed to me that she answered rather evasively, just saying that she'd got it from the office when she was working there. I pressed her, and at last she told me that one evening she was just on the point of leaving the office when she remembered that some friends were coming in after dinner at home. We should almost certainly play a paper game of some kind, and we had run out of suitable paper. She hurried up the stairs again, back to the office, dumped her attaché case on the table, and opened it, hastily snatched up some paper from the pile beside her typewriter, and threw it into the case. In her hurry, she didn't realize how much she'd taken, and that supply, which was supposed to tide us over one evening, had actually lasted for nearly 4 years. She must have taken something like half a ream. Well, I went away from my sister's house, rather startled. Before I left, I examined the remaining sheets, and so far as I could see, they were exactly like the one on which the letter was typed. Even the edges were a little discolored, too. I was more than startled. I was alarmed, because I ought to tell you that it had already occurred to me that of all the ways of going about the search for the person who had sent that letter to Sir Eustace, the one that seemed most hopeful was to look for its writer among the actual employees or ex-employees of the firm itself. As a matter of fact, this discovery of mine had a more disconcerting side still. On thinking over the case, the idea had struck me that in the 2 matters of the notepaper and the method itself of the crime, it was quite possible that the police and everyone else had been putting the cart before the horse. It had been taken for granted, apparently, that the murderer had first of all decided on the method and then set about getting hold of the notepaper to carry it out. But isn't it far more feasible that the notepaper should have been already there in the criminal's ownership, and that it was the chance possession of it which actually suggested the method of the crime. In that case, of course, the likelihood of the notepaper being traced to the murderer would be very small indeed, whereas in the other case, there is always that possibility. Had that occurred to you, for instance, Mr. President? I must admit that it hadn't, Roger confessed. And yet, like Holmes's tricks, the possibility's evident enough now it's brought forward. I must say, it strikes me as being a very sound point, Bradley. Psychologically, of course, agreed Miss Dammers. It's perfect. Thank you, murmured Mr. Bradley. Then you'll be able to understand just how disconcerting that discovery of mine was. Because if there was anything in that point at all, anybody who had in his or her possession some old notepaper of Mason's with slightly discolored edges immediately became suspect. Umph! Sir Charles cleared his throat forcibly by way of comment. The implication was obvious. Gentlemen don't suspect their own sisters. Dear, dear, clucked Mr. Chitterwick more humanly. Mr. Bradley went on to pile up the agony. And there was another thing which I could not overlook. My sister, before she went in for her training as a secretary, had played with the idea of becoming a hospital nurse. She went through a short course in nursing as a young girl and was always thoroughly interested in it. She would read not only books on nursing itself, but medical books too. Several times, said Mr. Bradley solemnly, I've seen her studying my own copy of Taylor, apparently quite absorbed in it. He paused again, but this time nobody commented. The general feeling was that this was getting really too much of a good thing. Well, I went home and thought it over. Of course, it seemed absurd to put my own sister on the list of suspects, and at the very head of it, too. One doesn't connect one's own circle with the idea of murder. The two things don't mix at all. Yet I couldn't fail to realize that if it had been anybody else in question but my sister, I should be feeling quite jubilant over the prospect of solving the case. But as things were, what was I to do? In the end, said Mr. Bradley smugly, I did what I thought my duty and faced the situation. I went back to my sister's house the next day and asked her squarely whether she had ever had any kind of relations with Sir Eustace Pennefather, and if so, what. She looked at me blankly and said that up till the time of the murder she had never heard of the man. I believed her. I asked her if she could remember what she had been doing on the evening before the murder. She looked at me still more blankly and said that she had been in Manchester with her husband at that time. They had stayed at the Peacock Hotel and in the evening had been to a cinema where they had seen a film called, so far as she could recall, Fires of Fate. Again, I believed her. As a matter of routine precaution, however, I checked her statements later and found them perfectly correct. For the time of the posting of the parcel, she had an unshakable alibi. I felt more relieved than I can say. Mr. Bradley spoke in a low voice, with pathos and restraint, but Roger caught his eye as he looked up, and there was a mocking glint in it which made the president feel vaguely uneasy. The trouble with Mr. Bradley was that one never quite knew with him. Having drawn a blank with my first ticket then, I tabulated the conclusions I'd formed to date and set about considering the other points in the case. It then struck me that the chief inspector from Scotland Yard had been somewhat reticent about the evidence that night he addressed us, so I rang him up and asked him a few questions that had occurred to me. From him I learnt that the typewriter was a Hamilton number. 4, that is, the ordinary Hamilton model, that the hand-printed address on the cover was written with a fountain pen, almost certainly an onyx fitted with a medium broad nib, that the ink was Harfield's fountain pen ink, and that there was nothing to be learned from the wrapping paper, ordinary brown, or the string. That there were no fingerprints anywhere, we had been told. Well, I suppose I ought not to admit it, considering how I earn my living, but upon my soul I haven't the faintest idea how a professional detective goes about a job of work, said Mr. Bradley with candour. It's easy enough in a book, of course, because there are a certain number of things which the author wants found out, and these he lets his detective discover, and no others. In real life, no doubt, it doesn't pan out quite like that. Anyhow, what I did was to copy my own detective's methods and set about the business in as systematic a way as I could. That is to say, I made a careful list of all the available evidence, both as to fact and to character, and it was surprising how much there was when one came to tabulate it, and drew as many deductions as I could from each piece, at the same time trying to keep a perfectly open mind as to the identity of the person who was to hatch out from my nest of completed conclusions. In other words, said Mr. Bradley, not without severity, I did not decide that Lady A or Sir Somebody B had such a good motive for the crime that she or he must undoubtedly have done it, and then twist my evidence to fit this convenient theory. Here, here! Roger felt constrained to approve. Here, here! Echoed in turn both Alicia Dammers and Mr. Ambrose Chitterwick. Sir Charles and Mrs. Fielder Fleming glanced at each other and then hastily away again, for all the world like two children in a Sunday school who have been caught doing quite the wrong thing together. Dear me, murmured Mr. Bradley. This is all very exhausting. May I have 5 minutes' rest, Mr. President, and half a cigarette? The President kindly gave Mr. Bradley an interval in which to restore himself. Chapter 11. I have always thought, resumed Mr. Bradley, restored, I have always thought that murders may be divided into two classes, closed or open. By a closed murder I mean one committed in a certain closed circle of persons, such as a house party, in which it is known that the murderer is limited to membership of that actual group. This is by far the commoner form in fiction. An open murder I call one in which the criminal is not limited to any particular group, but might be almost anyone in the whole world. This, of course, is almost invariably what happens in real life. The case with which we're dealing has this peculiarity that one can't place it quite definitely in either category. The police say that it's an open murder. Both our previous speakers here seem to regard it as a closed one. It's a question of the motive. If one agrees with the police that it is the work of some fanatic or criminal lunatic, then it certainly is an open murder. Anybody without an alibi in London that night might have posted the parcel. If one's of the opinion that the motive was a personal one, connected with Sir Eustace himself, then the murderer is confined to the closed circle of people who have had relations of one sort or another with Sir Eustace. And talking of posting that parcel, I must just make a diversion to tell you something really interesting. For all I know to the contrary, I might have seen the murderer with my own eyes in the very act of posting it. As it happened, I was passing through Southampton Street that evening at just about 9:15. Little did I guess, as Mr. Edgar Wallace would say, that the first act of this tragic drama was possibly being unfolded at that very minute under my unsuspecting nose. Not even a premonition of disaster caused me to falter in my stride. Providence was evidently being somewhat close with premonitions that night. But if only my sluggish instincts had warned me, how much trouble I might have saved us all. Alas, said Mr. Bradley sadly, such is life. However, that's neither here nor there. We were discussing closed and open murders. I was determined to form no definite opinions either way, so to be on the safe side, I treated this as an open murder. I then had the position that everyone in the whole wide world was under suspicion. To narrow down the field a little, I set to work to build up the one individual who really did it, out of the very meagre indications he or she had given us. I had the conclusions drawn already from the choice of nitrobenzene, which I've explained to you. But as a corollary to the good education, I added the very significant postscript, but not public school or university. Don't you agree, Sir Charles? It simply wouldn't be done. Public school men have been known to commit murders before now, pointed out Sir Charles, somewhat at sea. Oh, granted, but not in such an underhand way as this. The public school code does stand for something, surely, even in murder. So I am sure any public school man would tell me. This isn't a gentlemanly murder at all. A public school man, if he could ever bring himself to anything so unconventional as murder, would use an axe or a revolver, or something which would bring him and his victim face to face. He would never murder a man behind his back, so to speak. I'm quite sure of that. Then another obvious conclusion is that he's exceptionally neat with his fingers. To unwrap those chocolates, drain them, refill them, plug up the holes with melted chocolate, and wrap them up in their silver paper again to look as if they've never been tampered with. I can tell you, that's no easy job. And all in gloves, too, remember. I thought at first that the beautiful way it was done pointed strongly to a woman. However, I carried out an experiment and got a dozen or so of my friends to try their hands at it, men and women, and out of the whole lot I was the only one, I say it without any particular pride, who made a really good job of it. So it wasn't necessarily a woman, but manual dexterity's a good point to establish. Then there was the matter of the exact 6 minim dose in each chocolate. That's very illuminating, I think. It argues a methodical turn of mind amounting to a real passion for symmetry. There are such people. They can't bear that the pictures on a wall don't balance each other exactly. I know, because I'm rather that way myself. Symmetry is synonymous with order, to my mind. I can quite see how the murderer came to fill the chocolates in that way. I should probably have done so myself, unconsciously. Then I think we can credit him or her with a creative mind. A crime like this isn't done on the spur of the moment. It's deliberately created, bit by bit, scene by scene, built up exactly as a play is built up. Don't you agree, Mrs. Fielder Fleming? It wouldn't have occurred to me, but it may be true. Oh, yes. A lot of thought must have gone to the carrying of it through. I don't think we need worry about the plagiarism from other crimes. The greatest creative minds aren't above adapting the ideas of other people to their own uses. I do myself. So do you, I expect, Sheringham. So do you, no doubt, Miss Dammers. So do you at times, I should imagine, Mrs. Fielder Fleming. Be honest now, all of you. A subdued murmur of honesty acknowledged occasional lapses in this direction. Of course. Look how Sullivan used to adapt old church music and turn a Gregorian chant into a pair of sparkling eyes, or something equally unchant-like. It's permissible. Well, there's all that to help with the portrait of our unknown, and lastly, there must be present in his or her mental makeup the particular cold, relentless inhumanity of the poisoner. That's all, I think. But it's something, isn't it? One ought to be able to go a fair way towards recognizing our criminal if one ever ran across a person with these varied characteristics. Oh, and there's one other point I mustn't forget. The parallel crime. I'm surprised nobody's mentioned this. To my mind, it's a closer parallel than any we've had yet. It isn't a well-known case, but you've all probably heard of it. The murder of Dr. Wilson at Philadelphia, just 20 years ago. I'll run through it briefly. This man Wilson received one morning what purported to be a sample bottle of ale sent to him by a well-known brewery. There was a letter with it, written apparently on their official notepaper, and the address label had the firm's name printed on it. Wilson drank the beer at lunch and died immediately. The stuff was saturated with cyanide of potassium. It was soon established that the beer hadn't come from the brewery at all, which had sent out no samples. It had been delivered through the local express company, but all they could say was that it had been sent to them for delivery by a man. The printed label and the letter paper had been forged, printed specially for the occasion.